Hi, this is Stephanie Stock with Ohio Advocates for Medical Freedom. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Republican verified candidate Jim Trakas, who is running for the House of Reps in District 6, which is my district, so I'm very excited about that. Jim, before we get started, would you like to just tell us a little bit about yourself personally?
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks for the opportunity. Sure. My name's Jim Trakas. I'm 53 years old. I live in the city of Independence, and I have in my entire life. I am currently a city councilman there. I own a little company called American Online Learning Center, which provides probation and diversion programs that courts use to help people who have misdemeanor offenses. I am married to my wife, Anne Marie Kennedy, and my mother, Kathy, lives with the three of us in our house in Independence. Prior to my current tenure, I was a member of the House of Representatives from 1999 through 2006. I was chairman of the Republican Party in Cuyahoga County from 1996 through 2005. I am currently a captain with the Ohio Military Reserve and the company commander at the Green Road Armory for the 4th Civil Support and Sustainment Brigade, which is under the Adjutant General of the state of Ohio. So try to keep a busy life and to have a diverse interests here.
Wow, yeah, it definitely sounds like you do. I was going to ask you what experience or moment in time brought you into politics, but I guess I'll ask you what brought you back into wanting to go back into the House of Reps again.
Well, being born, I think, helped. Being a second generation Greek American, we invented this whole democracy thing. So it's always been a big interest of mine. My grandparents came to this country in the 1920s looking for freedom, and both economic and political freedom. Politics was something that was always discussed, and we were a part of. My father served in the United States Army during the Second World War with the 95th Infantry Division. So the cause of freedom was something that was very critical to him. And so just growing up in Independence, we had a large group of people who had fled Eastern Europe because of communism. We had people who fled because of imperialism and fascism in Europe in the early 20th century. So it has a profound effect on you to interact with people. I had a gentleman who was Armenian who had survived the Turkish massacre of 1915, who related his stories to me when I was a young boy. Many of these people were in my paper route when I delivered the Old Cleveland Press. So, politics, freedom, America's great causes were always something I was interested in. I was a freshman at Ohio State and I was going to be a business major. They told me I had to take 6 math classes, and I tried to find out any other major I can get to get out of the math classes. And I ended up seeking either journalism or political science, and thought political science was something I was very interested in. So I've always had an interest in the topic, and I think it's important to care about what goes on in your community. And I guess I'm kind of an independent cuss. I like to make decisions on my own, and I don't like people making decisions for me. So perhaps that's one of the things we share in common with Ohioans for Medical Freedom.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We both agree there. And it's cool that you have in your roots people that have experienced communism and a lack of freedom. And so I think a lot of the younger generation, they have no concept of that. And a lot of history is not really being told. So people just don't have a real sense of what that looks like. Having the boot of government on your throat like that in a very literal way.
Yes.
It's great that you have that history behind you, and that your family was involved with that kind of knowledge, and they can pass that on to you, and you can bring that to current day government. So that's great. Would you like to touch briefly on your platform, some things you hope to do if you get elected?
Sure. Thanks a lot. And appreciate this forum. It's really a wonderful opportunity. And you're a delightful constituent, and I'm answerable to you. So that's I take that very
seriously. Yes, you have to listen.
Yeah. Well, you have to listen to everybody, but yeah. I always think about it this way. It's like there's 11.5 million Ohioans. As a member of the House of Representatives, you'd have 120,000 bosses. Now, they don't always know what you're doing on a daily basis, so you have to let them know what's going on. And it's critical to get feedback. I always call it my discount drug mart test. You'd get emails and calls at the State House, but if I went to Drug Mart trying to buy one of their $5 bottles of wine that I enjoy, and someone said there was an issue out there that I should be paying attention to, that was really an issue. It wasn't just what interest groups thought were issues, but what actual people did too. Thanks for asking about my agenda. I've got a very bold agenda. I sought to return to the Ohio House of Representatives 2 statistics that I thought were very glaring. So when I was elected in the year 1998, at a young age, I'm not young anymore, the state of Ohio had 11.5 million people. Today, we have 11.5 million people. So we're not growing as a state. We're not attracting immigrants. We're not attracting people from across the country. And that means we are stagnant with respect to jobs. So I think it's critical that we have a much more vibrant and focused jobs atmosphere and change Ohio in order to make it so. I'm also very interested in the fact that when I was elected in 1998, $54,000 was the average household income. Today, it's just about the same thing. So we're kind of going backwards in a way because it's not keeping up with inflation. So it's those good jobs, the kind of decent wage jobs that we're not attracting. When I was elected in 1998, 26% of Ohioans worked in manufacturing. Of course, many of us in Northeast Ohio, my father and most of our family members and myself worked in manufacturing. Today, it's only about 8% of the population. So we've been going through some transition, not necessarily Ohio's fault, but I think there's some things that we could be doing to attract jobs and attract better paying jobs to benefit the people of Ohio and to bring new people in. And I fundamentally believe that education, having the curricula that is not propaganda, but true curricula to educate people. You know, my mother and father were part of the greatest generation. They learned perfect English. They learned math tables in their head. My mom can still do math tables in her head and at an advanced age. So it's, you know, this is important for people. I think we've gotten away from some of that. We need to get back to some of the traditional things that work rather than some of this experimentation in education. And then the cost of education. I look at college, and when I graduated from Ohio State in the year 1987, I spent $2,000 a year. I graduated and I didn't owe anybody a dollar. Today, my nephew graduated from Ohio State 2 years ago, $20,000 a year. He's not getting 10 times the education that I got. And more importantly, you know, the state used to provide up to about 40% of the cost to colleges. Today, it's about 17%. We got to get back on that again. We've got to prioritize education to have a really knowledgeable workforce, and that's how jobs come to this state. Lastly, with respect to healthcare, very critical issue. I was one of the people who pushed for a prescription drug benefit if people, you know, years ago. And I think it's really critical on the healthcare front that we have transparency so people know what they're buying and they can shop around, and that creates, that competition creates a lower cost if possible. But also the reality of the fact is that we have really great healthcare, and I just think that it's really critical that people have access to that, and they have to have good consumer choices. And so being part of that is important. And I think with respect to, we take care of my mom, and having in-home care as a more viable option so that middle class and working class people are able to access the in-home care options, so that maybe they can make a decision that they can keep somebody in their home, or the family member could live with them if they had the choice of being able to have in-home care. I think that's fundamentally important. And I think it also might be less expensive for the taxpayers of the people of Ohio. So those are some of the issues I'm working on.
Okay, that's great. Do you have any bills you've sponsored in the past that you'd like to highlight, or a bill you think you might want to propose if you get into office?
Well, I've got a lot of them.
Head item.
Gosh, Stephanie, that's a little bit of a loaded question. I made 14 laws when I was a legislator, and a whole host of amendments and things that I put into the bill. But I guess a couple things that I'd like to just highlight. You know, Bill Cosby went to jail the other day, labeled a violent sexual predator. It was my legislation in the state of Ohio that made a violent sexual predator. And if he was in Ohio, he would serve a minimum of 10 years in prison, not 3 years in prison. So I changed that standard because I think those types of people who are serial offenders are bad people that need to be, that society needs to be protected from. I also had kind of a fun bill. You've seen how the micro brewing industry has grown up around Ohio. You know, that was something that legislation that I worked on. After the legislation passed in 1999, a whole host of new people have created hundreds of jobs in Ohio, thousands of jobs in the alcohol industry. We modernized our laws, and I thought that was something that, you know, people was able to enjoy, at least in District 6. I also was responsible for the idea behind the Third Frontier ballot initiative. And this was something that the Ohio Board of Regents at the time, now the Department of Higher Education, came up to the state and said, we should have a high-tech jobs initiative. But we didn't have the funds to pay for it at the time. The state was trying to stay out of a recession. And so I came up with the idea of having a ballot initiative where the voters of Ohio got to vote on this and put it in our state. And by the way, that's created over 250,000 jobs since my idea was passed through the General Assembly. So those are some things I did before. What I'd like to try to do this time, I've got a fountain of ideas, many of them related to education. I'd like to change the school funding formula so that we're able to have what they call property tax wealthy districts aren't penalized by having jobs and people who are willing to pay for property taxes. I think that has gone a little bit too high, and I think the state needs to step up and help our types of districts as well. I'm also very much interested in changing the state constitution so that we have a stable school funding system. Some people think it's unconstitutional. It isn't. The state Supreme Court said that it was okay by them. Maybe they didn't like it, but there was anything that they could do. That was back in 2003. But I do think we should spell out what the obligation of state government is with respect to education. I would like to get back to those days on college, to lower college costs, to re-implement Governor Jim Rhodes' idea to have a 50% solution. The state provides 50% of the resources to colleges and universities. The colleges and universities have to ask for tuition and then private fundraising for another 50% of it. But in that way, it would dramatically lower tuition. And I also think the colleges have to be strategic. They've got to get rid of, they can't be all things to all people. So create some of those regional centers of excellence so that the schools that are doing it the best in certain types of disciplines, that's where people go. And we can have the other schools get rid of some of those programs and other non-strategic programs that just add cost to college education and not necessarily value. Those are a couple things I'd like to do. And the last thing I really have a passion for is changing the state's business climate by changing how businesses can be structured in Ohio. It sounds kind of mundane, but many businesses are able to do business in the state of Delaware. And so, you look at some of the Delaware model, we can apply some of those here and create advantages so that when you are incorporated in Ohio, if you have a corporate headquarters in Ohio, the chances of you employing people in Ohio are much higher. And I think we need to be looking at how we can do that as well. It's like, we've got to be vibrant. We've got to change the way we're thinking because I think what we've been doing for the past, 20, 30 years has been trying to get ahead, but we haven't really exceeded at that. And I think we need to do it.
Yeah, I'm going to just go off track for just a minute here, but you're talking a lot about employers and bringing jobs. And I just like to address the fact that with our group in particular, many of our followers are healthcare professionals, as you know, and many of us being driven away from our professions, or those going to college are being driven away because they don't want to have to be vaccinated. Maybe that's not their life choice. Going into school, a lot of the schools are requiring it, particularly nursing schools and things like that, where you're going into the medical field. So that's driving them away from those colleges. It's also driving them away from jobs. Some of us who have been, I've been a physical therapist assistant for 20 years. And I have one place of employment that's about 35 minutes away that can have me work 1.5 days a week. That's all they have for me. It's one of the few places that isn't requiring a flu shot to work there. So we are losing a lot of excellent healthcare workers, both in home healthcare, in acute care, and in like skilled nursing type settings and regular doctor's offices because of a mandate trickling down basically from Healthy People 2020, which is a federal agency threatening to withhold, Medicare funding to these facilities if they don't report the vaccination rate for flu shots. So, we've had a lot of back and forth with politicians about, well, that's an invasion of employer rights. But the issue is, it's not about the employer making a decision. It's about the federal health agencies, basically threatening their funding if they don't do it. So would you want to speak to that? Would you have anything to say to that? I mean, as far as jobs go, I think this is a huge effect because I think there's somewhere around, I think it's 400 and something thousand healthcare employees in Ohio. And if many of us are being driven away that are currently professionals and incoming professionals are being driven away, those are the very types of jobs you're trying to promote.
So yes, thank you. And yes, I would love to speak to that. So just give you a little by way of example. So last year, my mother was in a facility and she had broken her leg and she was recovering. Gave her a flu shot. The next day she contracted shingles. Now, I read where that's possible that there's a connection between those. I can't confirm that. I'm not a healthcare professional, but those are things that are important individually. Now, when I was in the legislature before, I voted against several of these mandated vaccinations. The reason I voted for them is I thought, well, if you don't think that that's right for you, you shouldn't have to have that, particularly if you're a young person. And if a parent and a young person make a decision and make a choice and say that they don't want to have something administered to them, I think that's your right. I mean, I believe in parents' rights and the rights of individuals. With respect to what you're saying, there is a line between, the private sector and what they would like to see, as well as how the government interacts. You're talking about now a government mandate forcing, businesses and forcing agencies to do something like that. And I don't think that's fair, because I'm not sure that, that all these things are effective. I know I've gotten flu shots several times and gotten the flu within a month of that happening. So, sometimes they say, well, the strain's different this year, that type of thing. I just try to live a healthy lifestyle, and I try to have a limited amount of things in my system that wasn't God created, initially as I can. So, I think you raise a very important point, and there's an increasing amount of people who do have concerns about this. So, I think that should be an individual right. And I respect why employers would want to keep everybody healthy, but there's more than one way to keep people healthy. And I think people have to be cognizant of that as well. Ultimately, our federal government is way too intrusive. They're getting involved in all sorts of things, just, between healthcare and education, all these different mandates. I don't think it's improving the system. I think they've got to take the shackles away. We should be able to apply for waivers from those types of programs to say, make these voluntary. And I don't have a problem with that. If people feel that they're going to be healthier or more protected because they do take a vaccine, that's their choice. However, at the same time, if they don't think that it's in their best interest, they shouldn't have to be forced to do it.
Yeah, agree. And just to speak to your mom, because I didn't know that about your mom specifically, but my dad had a flu shot when I was a senior in high school, and he developed shingles on the brain within a few days following, and we almost lost him. He nearly died, and it was $30,000 in debt for my parents, which in the mid 90s, I guess that doesn't seem like a lot of money, but it was to our family. We almost went bankrupt over the hospital bills from that. So I can attest to that having happened as well. And we do have a bill, HB 193, which it's its second time around. I know I mentioned it to you.
Yes.
Basically stating that an employer cannot force you to take a flu shot. So we hope that any of the people that get in will find somebody that can carry this bill again, because it's getting close to the end, and it's been kind of tabled because nobody wants to deal with controversial issues. They want to pass let's celebrate Groundhog Day again or whatever bills instead of things that are preventing people from having a job and feeding their families, like a flu shot mandate. But so I appreciate your stance on that. That's wonderful.
And just so you know, one of the things I've always tried to do with legislation is I try to bring people who I don't think would like the legislation in ahead of time and help me craft something that might make sense to them. So if our employer community objects to that, there's ways around this. There's ways to compromise and to work on things. So sometimes you have a very good idea, you might be able to get 75% of what you originally started. But I've always worked in legislation on doing that. Almost every bill that at least got to the floor made it through and was signed into the law by the governor. I was in leadership, so I didn't sponsor a lot of bills at one time. But the reality is that you have to work with people, and so there's a divergence of interests. And I always think if you can get 50% of what you wanted, that's a pretty good start. And then if you see how effective they are, maybe you can get the rest at some point in time. So don't give up the ship. It's always a good thing to have the debate on these types of items. And maybe there's some philosophical as well as some practical reasons why legislation doesn't go forward. But I've always thought it's a good idea to get everybody in the room first, find out what the objections are, see if you can handle as many of them as possible before you go out and introduce bills.
Well, that's a great strategy. And if you get in office, I'm going to be hitting you up on that.
You got my number. I know that was.
I do. Now I know your kind of your personal situation, your personal stance. Have you been hearing from any Ohioans on the issues of informed consent and medical freedom? I mean, is it just from us you're hearing about it, or have people come to you on this issue in the past?
Yeah, no. So over the years, I've been a legislator. I'm a city councilman currently. I was a city councilman years ago. and a legislator. And I have had people from time to time discuss this. So it hasn't been a large amount of people, but certainly it's an issue that I was cognizant of before I knew about your group. And I was very glad to hear that you felt so strongly about it that you chose to organize and do something about it. It's like, that's one of the great things about representative democracy. And I know that, your group has concerns about other lobbying organizations and other individuals who have a say in these things. We can all be individual lobbyists. And I think that's wonderful. And it's up to us as elected officials or who are seeking political office to listen to all sides and take that balance of the arguments in together, so that you can make proper decisions. So I think it's healthy that there's lobbying groups. Some people say, oh, it's terrible, there's lobbyists out there. Well, everybody deserves to have something, that they believe in. You're an individual lobbyist. You care about a single item that's important to you. But you know what? Thank God for you and your passion and for those of your organization. And these types of things spread. Other people say, hey, yeah, I've been talking about this for years. I had no idea that this group was out there. And suddenly you become the largest organization in the state, and you don't realize it. So you got to stick to it and keep advancing ideas. And it reminds me of old Bum Phillips. He was the Houston Oilers coach, and they couldn't beat the Pittsburgh Steelers in the 1970s. And they said, last year we knocked on the door, and this year we knocked a little louder, and next year we're going to kick the son of a gun in. So you got to just keep it advancing and keep focused on your goals.
Yeah, everybody get your boots on. Let's kick that door down.
I cleaned that up a little bit, by the way.
Oh, you probably did. So I guess you kind of answered my next question about how you feel about trade organizations influencing policy. I guess you're basically saying, freedom for everybody, individuals, organizations. You kind of want to hear from everybody. You're fine with hearing from everybody. It's basically what you said, which is fine. I just hope that we get equal time. That seems to be a real issue at the State House. The the bigger organizations with the money, the campaign money, it's how that goes. They get their full time, and we all get cut off at 3 minutes or whatever. And so I guess we just have to be the thorn in their side that simply won't go away until they finally say, "Oh, fine, give them their 5 minutes," or they're just going to keep coming back.
Well, so don't forget. So the first colonists came to the United States in the late 1500s, and then you had the colonies started up. And it wasn't until 1775, over 100 years later, that they got angry enough to have a revolution. So keep focused on your goals.
Yes, we don't have the pitchforks and torches out just yet, but we're getting close. How do you feel as far as the rights defined in the Ohio and U.S. Constitution? Do you feel that religious freedoms with regard to even medical choice would be covered under the constitutions?
So I'm not a judge, and so I would just give you an opinion as opposed to an educated opinion. But I do think that that's the case. So, I believe in the First Amendment. I believe in all the Constitution. And when you take an oath, and I've taken an oath as a military officer, as an elected official, to defend that Constitution, part of that is understanding what's in it. So, when you talk about the freedom of religion, I would happen to think that this is part of that. And I think various courts have ruled that you would be correct in that over time. I don't know what they've said in Ohio about it, but I do think that absolutely, becomes an issue of your own religious convictions, and you have a very valid point along those lines. So again, I'm not a judge. Don't take that as the law of the land, but that would be my interpretation.
Okay, well, that sounds great. Did you have any comments that you'd like to maybe leave with our viewers, ways that they can best make an impact at the State House, or any closing comments?
Sure. Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, it's like, I love the grassroots. It's so exciting to see that. My great-grandfather was part of a grassroots movement. He was part of the Greek Revolution of 1821. So it went from ideas in Greek cafes to overturning the Ottoman Empire. So, keep focused on your goals. I would just say that, interacting with legislators is really important, and try to be as knowledgeable as you can on the issues. It's great to have passion and emotion, and backing that up with facts and figures and ideas are always very beneficial. So, elected officials need to hear from their constituents. Sometimes you agree, sometimes you don't agree. As I always like to say, disagree by not being disagreeable. It's always important because you never know. Sometimes someone was against your position, and maybe the next term in the legislature had convinced them. So, I'll give you an example on mental health parity. This was an issue that came up in the late 1990s, and insurance companies did not cover mental health as much as it did physical health. And so a number of people in the legislature said, well, they should be compelled to do that. Well, of course, there is a cost to that, and that cost is borne by everybody who buys an insurance policy. But ultimately, and I was one of the ones who didn't think that that mandate should go through. And ultimately, after talking to enough people who had interacted with the system and said, gee, if I would have just had the, right, whether it be prescription or mental health training or, therapy or whatever, maybe I'd be in much better shape in life. And I ultimately voted for the mental health parity bill. It passed by one vote in the Ohio House of Representatives. So I didn't start out as a believer in it, but after talking to enough people and seeing for myself, that happened. And that's one of the reasons it's law today. So, don't give up, don't get angry at people, advocate for your positions. And the other thing I would advise you to do is to talk with the other organizations who may not agree with you and see if there's some common ground that you can come up with. That's always important because there are important lobbying organizations out there. They represent important perspectives as well. And keep in mind that legislators have to balance all of those different perspectives when they come to see you. So yeah, I know it's frustrating when you're in a committee hearing at, you drove to Columbus and you have a job and you had to take off your job and you get there, you get 3 minutes, you sit down, half of the people on another committee, another third are asleep. It's frustrating at that time. But you know what? People do read your testimony. So even if they weren't there, the testimony is all online. Legislators are diligent. I think public officials, by and large, are very diligent and want to be responsive to their citizens. And so they do read what you have to say. So don't underestimate the power of representative democracy.
All right. Well, I appreciate so much your time, Jim. I know you've had a hectic month, you got a hectic week, you got a hectic rest of the day, I think, too. So we need to let you get on with your day. But thank you so much for being with us. I encourage all of you, please get your buns to the polls on November 6th. Vote for a medical freedom candidate. Use our online tools to find out who is in your district that supports your beliefs on informed consent and medical freedom. And I hope you have a great night, Jim. Thank you again so much.
My pleasure to be with you and your group, Stephanie. Keep doing God's work out there.
Thank you.